This story tells how the life of an ordinary man who once walked quiet streets delivering letters and newspapers was torn apart by war, and how the same hands that sorted envelopes would one day carry messages capable of changing the fate of entire battalions. Before the war, his name was rarely remembered. He was simply the postman. Every morning at the same hour, he stepped out of his small apartment, adjusted his worn coat, and lifted the familiar leather mailbag onto his shoulder. He knew the city not by maps, but by memory. Every street corner, every crooked staircase, every rusted mailbox told him where he was. He knew which doors opened quietly and which creaked loudly, which families waited anxiously for letters and which ones pretended they did not care. To him, addresses were not numbers. They were lives. He remembered names better than faces. Old widows who lived alone on the third floor, factory workers who only received mail once a month, young couples who waited for letters filled with hope. The rhythm of his life was predictable, almost invisible, and he liked it that way. He believed that the world functioned because small, unnoticed jobs were done correctly every single day. Then the war arrived, not suddenly, but heavily, like a storm that everyone senses before the first thunder strikes. At first, it was rumors. Then mobilization notices appeared among the letters. The same hands that once delivered invitations and postcards now handed over orders that sent men away forever. Streets grew quieter. Windows were dark at night. Radios spoke in urgent tones until one day they stopped speaking altogether. When the front drew closer, the postal service collapsed. Offices closed. Routes were abandoned. But messages did not stop existing just because infrastructure failed. Information became more valuable than food. Orders, intelligence reports, coordinates, evacuation commands, everything depended on communication. And that was when someone remembered the postman. He was summoned not to a recruitment office, but to a small improvised headquarters hidden in a half-destroyed administrative building. A young officer looked at his records and asked a strange question. "How well do you know the city?" The postman answered honestly, "I know it by heart." That answer changed everything. At first his tasks were simple. He carried handwritten notes between command posts when radios failed or were intercepted. He moved quietly, without drawing attention, wearing civilian clothes when possible. Soldiers learned quickly that if the postman arrived, the message would get through. He never ran unless necessary. He never panicked. He memorized routes instantly, adjusting when streets were blocked or shelled. Soon, the messages grew more important. He was entrusted with sealed envelopes marked for senior officers, sometimes for generals themselves. He was never told what was inside, and he never asked. He understood one rule clearly. The message mattered more than the messenger, but without the messenger, the message was useless. Shelling became routine. Streets he once walked peacefully now exploded beneath his feet. Buildings collapsed where mailboxes once hung. He learned to move between artillery barrages, to recognize the sound of incoming fire, to freeze when aircraft passed overhead. The war did not teach him courage. It demanded discipline. There were days when he carried orders that redirected entire units, preventing them from walking into ambushes. Days when his arrival meant evacuation instead of annihilation. Once, after delivering a message to a field commander, he overheard an officer whisper, "If this hadn't arrived, we'd be dead by morning." He never responded. He simply adjusted the strap of his bag and walked back into the smoke. By the end of that first winter, soldiers no longer called him the postman. They called him the runner. Generals trusted him with information too sensitive for radio transmission. When all technology failed, when wires were cut and frequencies jammed, he became the last line of communication. He carried letters through fire not because he was fearless, but because he understood something others forgot. Messages are lives folded into paper. And he never lost them. As the war expanded, silence became more dangerous than noise. Radios crackled less often, wires were cut almost daily, and coded transmissions were intercepted before they could reach their destinations. Commanders learned a harsh truth. Technology failed first. What remained was the human factor, and the postman became indispensable. His assignments were no longer limited to short routes inside the city. He was sent beyond familiar streets into zones marked only by ruins and shifting front lines. He carried messages wrapped in oilcloth, folded so many times they seemed part of his palm. Some were written in haste, others in careful, deliberate handwriting. He never read them. He didn't need to. The weight of responsibility was enough. One evening, he was summoned again, this time to a bunker deep beneath a former courthouse. A general stood bent over a map, lit by a flickering lamp. The room smelled of damp concrete and burned paper. When the postman entered, the conversation stopped. "You've delivered every message so far," the general said quietly, "even when others failed." The postman nodded. He did not see this as praise. It was simply a statement of fact. "You'll take this directly to the forward command," the general continued, sealing an envelope with wax. "No radio, no intermediaries. If this doesn't arrive by morning, the eastern flank collapses." The route was longer than any he had walked before. It passed through areas under constant artillery fire, across streets that no longer existed on maps, and through neighborhoods now occupied by enemy patrols. He studied the terrain not on paper, but by memory, imagining how the city once flowed, how people moved before war broke everything apart. He left at night. Moving through darkness was different now. The war had taught him how to listen rather than look. Distant engines meant armor. Sudden silence often meant danger. He avoided open spaces, moving along walls, through alleys, sometimes crawling when the street offered no cover. His civilian coat was patched and faded, but it helped him blend into the ruins, just another shadow among shadows. Halfway through the journey, the shelling began. Explosions tore into the ground ahead of him, lifting stone and dust into the air. He pressed himself against the remains of a brick wall, counting the seconds between impacts. He knew this rhythm. It was not random. It meant someone was advancing or retreating. When the barrage paused, he moved again. At one point, enemy soldiers crossed the street ahead. He flattened himself beneath debris, barely breathing. The envelope inside his bag felt heavier than ever, as if it resisted every second of delay. When the soldiers passed, he waited longer than necessary. Patience had saved him more times than speed. Near dawn, exhausted and covered in grime, he reached the forward command post, a collection of trenches and reinforced basements barely holding together. When he handed the envelope to the officer in charge, the man stared at him in disbelief. "You came alone?" the officer asked. "There was no other way," the postman replied. "The message changed everything. Units were repositioned, An entire regiment avoided encirclement. Artillery fire was redirected just in time to halt an enemy push. By sunrise, what could have been a collapse became a controlled withdrawal. Lives were saved, not by firepower, but by information delivered on foot. Word spread quickly. From that day forward, when a message was too important to risk through the air, it was given to him. Generals trusted him not because he was brave, but because he was precise. He never improvised recklessly. He followed logic, memory, and discipline. His routes became legends whispered among soldiers. If the runner can pass, the message will survive. But with trust came danger. Enemy intelligence began to notice patterns. Intercepted reports mentioned a courier who appeared where radios failed. Patrols were instructed to watch for civilians moving too confidently through contested zones. Bounties were discussed. The postman did not know this yet, but the war was beginning to look for him, and soon it would find him. The war does not ignore patterns for long. At first, the postman noticed small changes. Streets he had crossed dozens of times now felt watched. Windows remained dark, yet he sensed eyes behind broken glass. Enemy patrols lingered longer at intersections, not searching aimlessly, but waiting, observing. The city was learning, and so was the enemy. His name was still unknown, but his function was not. A captured transmission, intercepted days later, would describe him simply as the courier who walks where radio silence lives. That was enough. The next mission came sooner than expected. A sealed packet marked with red thread. Urgent, strategic, irreplaceable. It contained updated troop movements and confirmation of a suspected collaborator within command ranks. If delivered, it would expose a traitor close to the generals themselves. If lost, it would strengthen the enemy from inside. The postman understood the weight instantly. He left before dusk, choosing a longer route deliberately. Predictability was now a liability. He avoided his usual streets, passing instead through industrial zones and half-flooded underpasses. His boots sank into mud mixed with ash. The smell of oil and rust clung to the air. This was no longer the city he once delivered letters in. It was a living battlefield layered with invisible threats. Halfway through the route, the first sign appeared. A flare ignited the sky behind him, bathing the ruins in pale white light. He froze instantly, pressing himself flat against a collapsed wall. Seconds later, boots echoed. Too coordinated to be random patrols. They were sweeping, searching. The enemy was closing nets now, not casting lines. He waited. Minutes stretched into eternity. Sweat ran cold down his spine despite the winter air. The envelope in his satchel felt like it pulsed, reminding him why he was there. He controlled his breathing, letting the sounds define the danger rather than his fear. When movement resumed, he changed direction entirely. Instead of heading north, he cut west, toward an area recently bombed into near-total ruin. Buildings there offered little shelter, but also little reason for patrols to linger. The ground was unstable, riddled with craters filled with rainwater and debris. Every step risked noise, injury, or worse. But the enemy rarely searched where survival itself seemed unlikely. He moved slowly, methodically, as he always had. Hours passed. At one point, a patrol passed so close he could hear their quiet conversation. One soldier complained about the cold. Another joked about civilians still trying to move through the city like ghosts. The postman did not react. He had learned long ago that invisibility was not about hiding. It was about behaving as if you belonged nowhere. Near midnight, the danger escalated. A searchlight swept across the rubble ahead, followed by shouted commands. The enemy had established a checkpoint, temporary, improvised, but lethal. The road beyond was cut off. The postman retreated into a shell of what had once been an apartment block. Inside, staircases were gone, floors collapsed into vertical traps. He climbed carefully, testing each step, ascending not to escape, but to observe. From above, he saw the scope of the operation. This was not a random patrol. This was a hunt. Routes were being closed systematically. Messengers had been intercepted elsewhere. Someone had spoken, or someone had been watched long enough. Either way, the net was tightening and time was bleeding away. He considered destroying the packet. It was an option he had been trained for. If capture was certain, the message could not survive him. But certainty had not arrived yet. There was still movement, still shadow, still choice. He waited until the patrol shifted positions. Then he descended, not the way he came, but through a broken wall, into an alley half-choked with debris. He crawled, tearing his coat, scraping his hands raw. Pain did not matter. Only silence did. At dawn, he reached a drainage canal that cut beneath the city like an old scar. The water was freezing, the walls slick with moss and grime. He waded through it for nearly an hour, following its curve until it emptied near a fortified district, still under friendly control. When he emerged, exhausted, soaked, and barely standing, soldiers aimed rifles at him instantly. He raised his hands slowly. "I have a message," he said simply. The envelope arrived intact. The collaborator was identified within 48 hours, arrested quietly, removed without spectacle. A breach that could have doomed multiple operations was sealed because one man walked instead of transmitting. After that night, the postman was no longer just a courier. He became a variable the enemy could not eliminate easily. And for the first time, he understood something chilling. As long as he kept walking, the war would keep trying to stop him. After that night, the rules changed. The postman was no longer sent only between safe zones or familiar ruins. His routes became unpredictable by design. Orders reached him verbally, often incomplete, sometimes intentionally vague. Locations shifted at the last minute. Drop points were altered while he was already on the move. This was not confusion, it was protection. He learned to accept uncertainty as part of the job. The letters he carried changed, too. No longer just reports or confirmations. Now there were sealed directives, emergency authorizations, and personal notes addressed to generals who no longer trusted radios, phones, or even their own aides. Ink replaced signals. Paper replaced waves. Human memory replaced machines. And that made him dangerous. The enemy began adapting. Checkpoints appeared in places that had never mattered before. Old men were questioned. Children were searched. Anyone walking alone too often became suspicious. The city itself seemed to recoil, its remaining civilians moving less, speaking less, surviving quietly. The postman adjusted by becoming smaller. He dressed differently now, layers mismatched, colors dulled by ash and grime. His satchel changed too, reinforced inside with false linings and waterproof seals. If captured, he would not look like a courier. He would look like a man who had lost everything and was wandering because there was nowhere left to go. The mission that nearly ended him came on a morning that felt deceptively calm. The sky was clear, no artillery, no sirens. That alone was unsettling. He was handed a single envelope, no markings, no urgency thread, just a name and a location written in careful block letters. A general stationed near the eastern edge of the city, coordinating a defensive realignment after heavy losses. The message was short, the officer said, but critical. "Do not stop," he was told. "If you must choose between speed and safety," the officer added quietly, "choose speed." He nodded once and left. Halfway through the journey, the silence broke. A low mechanical hum reached him first. Engines, distant, but closing. He ducked into a doorway just as armored vehicles rolled into the intersection ahead. Enemy units. Organized. Calm. They spread out with purpose, not panic. This was not coincidence. The postman waited, counting breaths, watching the pattern. He saw it then, the trap forming. Streets being sealed not in lines but in arcs. Anyone moving inward would be caught. Anyone moving outward would be followed. He chose neither. Instead, he went vertical. He entered a half-destroyed building and climbed. Each floor creaked under his weight. Dust fell with every step. At the top, he crossed through broken apartments, moving from building to building, using collapsed walls and exposed beams. The city looked different from above, emptier, sharper, crueler. A shot rang out below. They had seen movement. He ran, not blindly but precisely, counting steps, calculating gaps, remembering how he once navigated rooftops as shortcuts for deliveries years ago. A lifetime of knowing the city returned in fragments, guiding his body faster than thought. A bullet shattered masonry inches from his head. He did not slow. He jumped. The impact knocked the breath from him. Pain flared in his ankle, sharp and immediate. He bit back a sound and rolled into shadow as more shots followed. He dragged himself into an air vent, pulling the cover back into place just as soldiers flooded the roof. Inside the vent, the world narrowed to darkness, metal, and breath. His ankle throbbed. Blood soaked into his sock. He pressed his forehead against the cool steel and waited, listening to voices echo through the building. They searched methodically, confident he could not have gone far. They were right, but they were wrong about where. After nearly an hour, the voices faded. The postman did not move for another 30 minutes. When he finally emerged, he could barely walk. But he walked anyway. Every step sent pain up his leg. Every sound felt too loud. He leaned on walls, moved through alleys, crossed a market square littered with abandoned carts and torn banners. Civilians glanced at him and looked away. In war, suffering becomes invisible. He reached the destination just before nightfall. The general read the message in silence. Then he looked up slowly. "You were followed," he said. "Yes," the postman replied. "You were injured." "Yes." The general folded the letter carefully. "This message changes tomorrow's movement. If it had arrived late—" He did not finish the sentence. The postman nodded once. A medic was offered. He declined at first, then accepted when standing became too difficult to argue. As his ankle was bound, he stared at the wall, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. That night, he slept for the first time in weeks. And for the first time since the war began, he dreamed not of routes or streets, but of letters he had not yet delivered. Because he knew something now, with terrifying clarity. The enemy was no longer hunting messages. They were hunting him. Recovery was brief and incomplete. The ankle healed enough to walk, but never enough to forget. Pain became a quiet companion, a reminder with every step that his body was keeping its own record of the war. No one asked him to rest longer. No one needed to. He returned to duty because there was no ceremony for stopping. By now his name was no longer spoken openly. He was referred to indirectly, the carrier, the walker, the one who knows the streets. Even among allies, anonymity was protection. The fewer who could identify him, the fewer who could betray him under pressure, and pressure was everywhere. Intercepted convoys, ambushed couriers, captured runners who never returned, radios jammed without warning, entire units cut off for days, surviving blindly, waiting for orders that never came, except when he arrived. His role expanded beyond delivery. Commanders began asking his opinion, not on tactics, but on feasibility. Could a message reach this location by dawn? Was a route still passable after the last bombardment? Which streets were watched and which were forgotten? He answered honestly. Sometimes the answer was no. Once, a colonel slammed his fist against a table after hearing his assessment. "Then how do we move?" he demanded. The postman met his eyes calmly. "You wait," he said, "or you change the question." That restraint earned respect. The mission that forced his choice came weeks later. He was summoned late at night, brought into a dim room lit by a single lamp. Maps covered the walls, layered with handwritten notes and pins. At the center stood a senior general, older than most still fighting, his face carved by exhaustion rather than age. The general did not waste words. "We have lost all reliable communication with the Southern Division," he said. "They are holding a critical junction. If they fall, the evacuation corridor collapses." The postman listened, silent. "We need confirmation of their position," the general continued, "and we need to deliver new orders. Radio contact is impossible. Drones are being shot down." He paused, then added quietly, "This is not a delivery. This is penetration." The distance was extreme. The territory between was heavily controlled. Multiple enemy patrol zones overlapped. The chance of capture was high. Survival uncertain. The postman looked at the map. He traced the route with his finger slowly, stopping at several points. He recognized neighborhoods that no longer existed. Streets turned into trenches, intersections erased entirely. Finally, he looked up. "If I go," he said, "I won't be fast." "We don't need fast," the general replied. "We need certain." That was the moment where the job stopped being about letters and became about consequence. He asked only one question. "If I'm captured?" The general did not lie. "Then we deny knowing you?" The postman nodded. That night, he packed lighter than ever. No personal items, no identification, only the message, memorized as well as written, so it could survive even if the paper didn't. As he stepped into the dark, he understood something he had avoided admitting for months. He could stop. No one would force him. No one would drag him back if he refused. He had already done more than anyone could reasonably ask. But he also knew what would happen if he didn't go. The Southern Division would wait, confused, isolated. They would guess, improvise, and eventually make the wrong move. Not because they were weak, but because war punishes uncertainty, faster than mistakes. He walked. Days blurred together. He moved at night, hid during the day. He drank rainwater from shattered gutters, slept beneath collapsed staircases, navigated by memory when maps became useless. Once, he lay motionless for hours as enemy soldiers argued directly above him, boots scraping concrete inches from his face. He did not think about fear. Fear wasted energy. On the fifth night, he reached the outskirts of the division's last known position. Smoke drifted low across the ground. The air smelled of oil and metal. Distant gunfire echoed irregularly, defensive, desperate. He approached slowly, hands visible, calling out a phrase agreed upon months earlier, a verbal password that changed weekly. A rifle barrel emerged from the darkness, then another, then faces, gaunt, dirty, exhausted, but alive. They took the message without ceremony. The commander read it once, then again. His shoulders sagged, not with relief, but with understanding. "We move at dawn," he said, "because of you." The postman did not smile. As he turned to leave, the commander stopped him. "You won't make it back the same way." The postman nodded. "I know." When he disappeared into the smoke, none of them knew if they would ever see him again. But the junction held, and the evacuation corridor remained open, because one man chose not to stop walking. The return was harder than the journey in. The postman left the junction before dawn, just as the Southern Division began to move. He did not look back. If he did, he knew he might slow down, and slowing down was how people died. The route back no longer existed in the same way. Patrols had shifted. Streets that were empty days earlier were now crawling with soldiers. Fires burned unchecked, turning familiar neighborhoods into landmarks of destruction rather than direction. He adapted. Instead of following streets, he followed absences, places where no one stood guard, because nothing of value remained. He moved through courtyards, climbed through shattered apartments, crossed rooftops where doors had once been. His ankle failed him twice. The first time, he collapsed against a wall and waited until the pain dulled enough to stand. The second time, he stayed down longer, pressing his forehead into the dirt, counting his breaths, forcing his body to obey. No one was coming to help him. That knowledge, oddly, gave him clarity. On the third night, he was spotted. A searchlight swept across an open square just as he crossed it, freezing him in stark white. Shouts followed. Boots pounded stone. He ran, not fast, but decisively, turning corners without hesitation, trusting memory over sight. A shot rang out, then another. He felt a sharp impact in his shoulder, more force than pain at first. His body reacted before his mind caught up. He fell, rolled, and crawled into a drainage channel barely wide enough to hide him. The soldiers passed within minutes, convinced they had finished the job. He lay there until dawn, blood soaking his coat, fingers numb with cold. When he finally emerged, the city looked different, not physically, but emotionally. Something had shifted. He realized he no longer moved like a civilian pretending to be a soldier. He moved like someone who belonged to the war now, whether he wanted to or not. His caution was instinctive, his awareness constant. He noticed reflections in windows, shadows behind corners, changes in sound that meant danger. This frightened him more than the gunshot, because it meant there might not be a way back. He reached friendly territory 2 days later, exhausted, feverish, barely conscious. Medics dragged him inside a ruined school converted into a field hospital. They cut away his coat, cleaned the wound, stitched without anesthesia, because none was left. When he woke, a young officer stood at his bedside, holding a folded paper. "Command wants to see you," the officer said. "I can't walk far," the postman replied. "They'll come here," the officer answered. The general arrived that evening. He did not bring medals or speeches. He brought confirmation. The Southern Division had broken through. The evacuation corridor remained open for 48 crucial hours. Thousands had escaped, wounded soldiers, civilians, entire families who would have been trapped otherwise. The general looked at the postman carefully. "You were not mentioned in any reports," he said. "Officially, the message arrived by unknown means." The postman nodded. "That's fine." There was a pause. "You could stop now," the general said. "Your service record would allow it. No one would question your decision." The postman closed his eyes briefly. In that moment, he thought of his old route, the morning streets, the weight of letters in his bag, the sound of doors opening, of familiar voices greeting him by name. Then he thought of the men at the junction, of the commander's face when he read the message, of the certainty that followed confusion. "I'll finish this route," he said finally. The general did not argue. Weeks later, soldiers began telling stories about a man who appeared where radios failed, about orders arriving by hand when all else collapsed, about a figure who walked through fire not because he was brave, but because someone had to. The postman never corrected them. He did not ask for recognition, but quietly, without ceremony, the army adjusted its plans. Routes were drawn with him in mind. Messages were written knowing he would carry them. And somewhere between the ruins of cities and the silence of night, a former civilian became something else entirely, not a hero, not a legend, but a constant, a man who never lost the message. The war did not end suddenly. It thinned. Gunfire became less frequent. Bombings moved farther away. Nights grew quieter, though no one trusted the silence. For those who carried messages, this phase was the most dangerous. People assumed the worst was over and lowered their guard. The postman did not. His final assignment came without ceremony. A single envelope, no stamp, no return address. Inside, orders coordinating the last synchronized advance before the ceasefire. If the timing failed, entire units could collide or be cut off by retreating forces. Radio contact was unstable again, so they gave it to him. The route crossed. Territory neither side fully controlled. Fields filled with abandoned equipment. Villages emptied so quickly that meals still sat on tables. The postman moved through it all with the calm of routine, as if following a delivery schedule no one else could see. On the second night, he encountered civilians hiding in a cellar, an old man, 2 women, 3 children. They begged him to stay, to wait until morning, to not risk the road ahead. He knelt, adjusted the strap of his bag, and told them the truth. "If I don't leave now," he said, "someone else won't come home." They understood. Before dawn, he reached the final checkpoint. The officer receiving the message looked older than his uniform suggested. His hand shook as he read. "This changes everything," the officer said quietly. The postman nodded, already turning away. The ceasefire was declared 2 days later. There were celebrations in some places, in others only exhaustion. The postman watched it all from the edge, unsure how to participate. When the army began demobilizing civilians, his name appeared on the list. No rank, no medals, just a line stating, "Service completed." He returned to the city months later. It was quieter now, scarred, familiar, in fragments. His old route no longer existed as it once had, some streets renamed, others erased entirely. But people remembered him, not as a soldier, as the man who always arrived. He took his old job back, though the bag felt lighter than he remembered. Letters were fewer, addresses changed. But when he walked, people stepped aside instinctively, sensing something different. Sometimes veterans stopped him. "You carried messages, didn't you?" they asked. He would nod. "That was you?" they said, eyes wide. He would smile politely and continue on. Years later, in a small archive room, a clerk cataloging wartime records noticed something strange. Dozens of critical messages, all marked the same way. Delivered by hand. Courier, unspecified. No photograph. No official commendation. Only results. The postman never spoke of the war unless asked directly, and even then he spoke not of danger, but of responsibility. Someone had to make sure the words arrived, he would say. When he retired, there was no parade, just a quiet walk home on his final day. He hung his bag by the door and stood there for a long time, listening to the city breathe. The war had taken many things, but it had not taken this. The simple belief that every message mattered, and that as long as one person was willing to carry it, hope could still find its address.